The GTX 560 Ti. Released back on January of 2011, the GF114-based GPU was firmly refined. Released at a price of $249 USD, pricing and performance was smack in the middle of the Radeon 6950 2GB and the 6870 1GB. Nvidia had hoped to shake up the market with this card, but AMD had plans to crash their party. At the same time, AMD released the 6950 1GB, which was only priced $10 more and soundly beat the 560 Ti across the board. Competition was very fierce back then. The card we're looking at today was recently purchased locally, and I was under the impression it was a 1GB model. However, after receiving the card, I realized it was the less common 2GB variant. The extra VRAM should help it quite a bit in modern titles. So today we'll be cleaning up the card, we'll be testing it in 10 modern games, we'll be talking about its recent Dx12 capability, and then wrapping things up with power consumption. After removing the shroud and heatsink, I noticed the card had its fair share of dust, but nothing beyond normal use. I then removed the memory MOSFET plate and noticed the thermal pads were also in great shape. It was kind of interesting to see the memory MOSFET plate also had a raised fin portion above the MOSFETs to allow for better heat dissipation. Overall, the card looked like it was very well taken care of. The card we're testing today is a reference EVGA model. The card operates at a stock frequency of 822 MHz on the core and 2004 MHz on the memory, which is 4008 effective. We'll also be testing the card with an overclock to 1 GHz on the core, which is a 21% increase over stock. We also was able to raise our memory overclock to 2126 MHz, which is effective 4252. That's about a 6% increase over stock. Also note, I'll go ahead and list the test system specifications on the left-hand side. I also wanted to note that all the games tested today will be tested at 1080p. Okay, well, Destiny 2, the open beta, is the first game we tested, and we tested the game with the low preset, and the overall experience was rather good for such an old card. At stock frequencies, the 560 Ti averaged 44 frames per second, and overclocked that average rose 18% to 52. From the looks of it, the 1GB version of the card would have probably produced the same frame rate, as the game doesn't require a lot of VRAM at low settings. And even at low settings, the game still looks pretty good. The very popular Overwatch is up next, and with high settings at 100% resolution scale, we saw 70 frames per second on average. Overclocked, that number jumped up 15% to 81. Frame times were excellent, and the 560 Ti had no issues powering through this game. Battlefield 1 is the next game we tested, and here we used the medium preset in campaign mode. Our 560 Ti produced 38 frames per second, and overclocked, that number rose to 44, which is a 15% increase over stock. Frame times were excellent, and it appeared the game was allocating up to 1.5 GB of VRAM. Fallout 4 is up next, and with mostly medium settings with high textures, we saw an average frame rate of 59. Overclocked, that number rose 18% to 70. It was also nice having the 2GB of VRAM, as it gave us the ability to increase the texture quality. Frame times were pretty solid, but we did experience some hard dips, as reflected in our 0.1% lows. The Witcher 3 is up next, and with post-processing turned off and the graphic options set to the medium preset, we averaged 30 frames per second. Overclocked, that number rose 16% to 35. Frame times were just okay, with spikes and dips seen quite often in our gameplay. We did spend some time under 30 FPS when in Novigrad or in combat. The very popular PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is up next, and with a low preset at 100% resolution scale, we saw an average frame rate of 27. We're not showing the overclock numbers here because there really wasn't any difference. As shown in my GTX 470 and 480 videos, this game doesn't really care much for Fermi-based cards. As most mid to high-end Fermi cards, they'll hover around the 30 FPS mark at low settings. Everybody loves some GTA 5, so we're testing this game with high settings with FXAA enabled. The 560 Ti averaged 51 frames per second, and overclocked, that number jumped 15% to 59. Frame times were great. Also notice our VRAM usage was close to hitting that 2GB mark. Keep in mind, dropping some settings down to normal will allow us to achieve 60 frames per second on average. The googly-eyed game Mass Effect Andromeda is up next, and here the 560 Ti averaged 32 frames per second at the medium graphics preset. Overclocked, that number rose 15% to 37. Frame times were excellent, and the game pretty much ran like a console. Rainbow Six Siege is our next game, and here with the medium graphics preset using the built-in benchmark, we averaged 50 frames per second. Overclocked, that number rose 16% to 58. Frame times were excellent and the VRAM allocation was under 2 GB. Rise of the Tomb Raider is the last game we tested, and using the low preset and the built-in benchmark, we saw an average frame rate of 40 frames per second. Overclocked, that number jumped up 20% to 48. Frame times were very good, and the game itself doesn't use a lot of VRAM at these settings. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Dx12 compatibility. I'm not going to go into details about performance, as I covered much of that in my GTX 480 video, and you can check that out above. But as of driver 384.76, all Fermi-based cards have Dx12 support. Now the support is limited to a feature level of 11 with a Tier 1 resource binding, so some modern games that have the option to use either Dx11 or Dx12 should work, but you'll need to check them on a game-to-game basis. There are also a lot of UWP Dx12 only games available, and I wanted to test some of those out. So I installed Forza Motorsport 6 Apex, and this is what I was greeted with. After entering the code, I was shown the game requires Tier 2 resource binding, so playing it was a no-go. Now I don't own a copy of Gears of War 4, so I couldn't test that. However, I was able to install and play Halo 5 Forge. I didn't capture any frame rates or frame times, but performance appeared to be beyond 30 frames per second, which was playable for me. Still didn't help me from getting wrecked though. The last thing I wanted to test was overall power consumption, and to do that, I fired up The Witcher 3 and let the GPU heat up to its max temperature. And with stock frequencies leaving the fan speed on auto, the 560 Ti hit 74C and the entire system pulled 225 watts at the wall. After factoring PSU efficiency, the whole system was roughly consuming 191 watts. Now after dialing in our overclock, we saw temps rise to 79C with the fan speed maxed out. Our system power consumption rose to 307 watts at the wall. After factoring efficiency, the system was roughly consuming around 260 watts. Didn't test fan noise, but the card on auto fan speed under full load was very quiet and not distracting at all. So wrapping things up, we can see the 2GB variant of the 560 Ti still holds its own today at 1080p, and even more so when overclocked. However, some newer games like Mass Effect and PUBG don't do very well regardless of the overclock. Games like Overwatch and GTA 5 run extremely well with the 560 Ti, and you would also have no issues playing any modern esport or free-to-play titles such as CSGO, League of Legends, and World of Tanks. Overall, I enjoyed my time with the card and was surprised by the performance in recent games. Well, that wraps up our look at the 560 Ti 2GB model. If you enjoyed content like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel. Also, I want to say thank you to all my current subscribers for sticking around. F2F out.